Hello everybody and welcome to yet another IL-2 Sturmovik Cliffs of Dover tutorial. This time I'm going to focus on the Messerschmitt Bf110, the German twin-engined fighter. And this tutorial will be split in several parts. First of all, I'm going to give you a brief historical breakdown of the aircraft and its design. Then I'm going to talk about the various differences between the models included in the current Team Fusion 4.0 patch. I'm also going to talk a little bit about power settings for takeoff, cruise, combat, etc. And last but not least, I'm going to show you a startup procedure as well as a takeoff and landing with the 110. But first of all, what might be interesting about the Messerschmitt? Well, it was designed at about the same time as the Bf109, the single-seat, single-engined cousin to the 110. And the 110 was actually envisioned to be a long-range escort fighter, which at the time it was designed was not such a bad idea, because when it actually entered service, the 110 was substantially faster than most aircraft and fighters at the time. It's just that the design later on did not hold up to its age, and therefore was pretty quickly outclassed by its competition, especially in the Battle of Britain, where it for the first time really went head-to-head with the Supermarine Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane. And both of these fighters are about as fast or even slightly faster than the 110, much more agile, especially in a flat turn. They also climb better, and pretty much the only thing the 110 has going for it in such a matchup 1 versus 1 is that it dives better. It has a higher dive limit and picks up speed faster due to its weight, and it also has better firepower because it has in every version that it's currently included in Team Fusion 4.0 has the same armament of 4 light machine guns caliber 7.92 times 57 and a pair of 20mm cannons. The early version, the C2, actually has the MGFF cannon, and every other version has the somewhat later MGFFM cannon. The 110 actually participated in practically every theater of World War II, or at least in Europe, in every theater, of course not in the Pacific. And while up to the Battle of Britain it was thought that the 110 was a good enough fighter and escort fighter, it soon proved to be too vulnerable against other fighters, and therefore during the Battle of Britain, due to losses of 110 aircraft, they actually had to be escorted themselves. So the German High Command only slowly figured out that the 110 was not really going to cut it as a fighter in 1940 anymore. However, the 110 was not completely useless later on because it was a very good fighter bomber, and it also was a pretty good aircraft for night fighting. That's also where the 110 produced most of its aces. Most of the aces on the 110 actually flew the night fighter version and raked up very high scores. I think the most successful 110 pilot had somewhere around 100 air kills, which, considering the conditions they had to fly in almost pitch dark condition with sometimes not even really perfectly conditioned instruments and proper instrumentation, is really something that should deal a lot of respect towards them. So much for the historical background. I mean, there's lots and lots more to talk about in terms of the 110 and its service history, but this is just a very short breakdown of the aircraft, and I'm going to continue showing you the various differences of the 110 models. So right in front of us we have a Bf110C2. That is actually the earliest model included in Team Fusion 4.0, and it's also not a stock plane. It was actually introduced in TF 4.0. And some might wonder what is the difference as compared to like the C4. Well, the only difference is that the C2 is somewhat lighter, around 180 kilograms, and that is mostly due to a lighter armor. So it is less armored than the C4, and thus comes in at a slightly lower weight. Other than that, it is pretty much the same, both performance-wise and in most other regards. The C2 also has the earlier MGFF cannon, so it is not capable of firing the mine shells, which is not such a big deal. I mean, the MGFF has been improved in Team Fusion quite a lot in the Team Fusion 4.0 patch, and even the normal MGFF can deal out some substantial damage, especially in the case of the 110, which has all of its armament stacked up here in the nose. I'm just going to change the view here. You can actually see here on top of the nose the four gun barrels of the light machine guns, all of them MG17s, and they are unsynchronized, so they should be firing at about 1,200 rounds per minute. And down here you can actually see the gun barrels for the 20mm cannons, and each cannon has ammunition of about 180 rounds. But as the MGFF is drum fed, you cannot fire all of those 180 rounds in one go. But instead, the gunner actually has the duty of changing the drums in flight. So you have drums of 60 rounds, and after you run out in both drums, the gunner will actually rearm the cannons, and that's going to take a while. I think it takes like 10 to 20 seconds, and in a dogfight this can actually cause some trouble, because for that amount of time you're basically limited to the light machine guns only, so that can be somewhat irritating and might cause some issues. But other than that, the 110C2, as said, is identical to the C4, and it is a pure fighter version, meaning that it is not capable of carrying any bombs or anything. It's just basically the pure fighter version of the 110. Okay, so here we are with the Messerschmitt Bf110C4, and as said, this aircraft is better armored than the C2 that we just talked about. And otherwise, in every other term, it is pretty much identical. It doesn't carry any bomb racks and bombs. It's just a pure fighter version of the 110. There is also no visual difference whatsoever, so it is pretty much impossible to say whether you have a 110C2 or C4 flying about. You can only judge that from the in-game stat screen. The 110C4 is also powered by the same DV601B engine, which is basically just the multi-engine version of the DV601A found on the 109E. So it's basically the same engine as on the 109 E3 and E4. The C4, one slight difference to the C2, which we've already talked about, is the fact that the C4 gets the MGFFM cannons, so it's slightly it has a slightly more powerful armament simply because it can fire the very potent mine shells, which actually contain 18 grams of explosive as compared to about 4 gram of explosive in the ordinary high explosive shells are found on the stock MGFF cannon. So this is pretty much it for the C4, and I'm going to swap to the next variant. Okay, so in front of us we have another relatively new version of the 110 that's included in the Team Fusion 4.0 mod. This is the Bf110C4N, and as the name suggests, it is similar to the 109E4N in that it has a more powerful engine than the ordinary C4. It is also powered by the DB601N engine, or actually the twin-engined version of it, the DB601P. And that means it has actually superior performance to the C4 in pretty much every regard. It climbs better, turns better, and it's generally faster and at a higher altitude as well. So it has a higher full throttle height, and it should also have a higher ceiling. And in fact, it is, I think the C4N is actually faster at every altitude than the Hurricane Mark 1 with the rotor propeller and 100 octane. So in the C4N, flying this as a fighter, you should be relatively safe from a hurricane as long as you stay fast and don't go into a turn fight with a hurricane, which of course in the 110 is not going to end very well for you. Against the Spitfire it is much closer. You might be able to outrun the earlier versions, or especially those without 100 octane, but I'm not entirely sure you can outrun, say, a Spitfire Mark 1A 100 octane or a Mark 2A. Certainly not the Mark 2A, which is probably the fastest Spitfire currently modeled. The Mark 1A could be a very, very close call. But as said, you should never really get into a situation where you are up against lots of Spitfires or Hurricanes. Just what the 110 really excels at is intercepting bombers, and in a fighter versus fighter fight, the 110 is definitely at a disadvantage, especially if you're flying alone. You should never fly the 110 as an escort fighter by yourself. You should always bring friends. And of course, if you are being attacked, it is always advisable to try and dive away. And depending on how close your pursuer is, you can either go for a shallow dive, or you can just completely throw the aircraft into a vertical dive. If your opponent is pretty much in your neck, it is most advisable to really push the nose down, use the negative G issue of the Spitfire and Hurricane to the best of your advantage, and try and get as much separation as possible. However, if your opponent is still some distance away and not quite yet in firing range, it might actually be best to enter a shallow dive, maybe like 30 degrees, because that way you can pick up the most speed in the dive without throwing your altitude away, because the more shallow your dive is, the better the conversion between altitude and speed is going to be. Okay, so this is it for the 110C4. Let's move on to the fighter bomber versions. Alright, so right in front of us we have a Messerschmitt Bf110C7. This was actually the first fighter bomber version of the 110 in the game. It came stock with the game, and it has been expanded upon by the Team Fusion patches by one version, which just differs in the fact that the C7 late, which I'm going to show you just after this aircraft, has an automatic propeller pitch mechanism, and it also has more powerful engines. The C7, as shown here, can actually carry two 500-kilogram bombs, which you can see under the belly of the aircraft. Historically, the C7 was not the first fighter bomber version of the 110. In fact, there was a conversion of the C4 available before that, which was dubbed the Bf110C4B, so the nomenclature was the same as for the 109 versions, but the C4B was limited to two 250 kilogram bombs. So for the C7, that loadout actually doubled, although the aircraft had at its introduction the same engines as the C4. Later on, the C7 was actually given the DV601P engines, which are equivalent to the 109's DV601N engine. So it's running at higher RPM, has higher horsepower output, and needs higher octane fuel. So the 110 C7 is actually a very good fighter bomber. Those 500 kilogram bombs can actually deal a lot of damage to a point target, and it's just a lot of fun flying the 110 as a fighter bomber, because it's actually it actually carries not a lot less than, say, a Blenheim, and of course it's much faster than a Blenheim at pretty much every altitude, and it also has some respectable firepower. So if you ever get the opportunity to use your guns, you should never hesitate. But as said, never go into a turn fight with the 110. Just try and get off a shot and then extend, or even better, just head home, land, get some more bombs, and search for more targets. Okay, last but not least, here we have the Bf110C7 Late. As the name suggests, there are not all too many differences between it and the C7. Actually, the only differences are that the C7 has more powerful engines, the DV601P engine as said before, and it also has a automatic propeller pitch governor, so that's also quite nice, especially if you are in a dogfight or if you are going to make a high speed skip bombing run on enemy ships or some ground installation. So you don't always have to keep an eye on the propeller pitch, and you can concentrate on the actual attack instead. Okay, so let's discuss engine power settings in E110. We can actually split this up into two categories, basically. Those aircraft with the stock DV601A engine and those with the DV601P engine. So the less powerful A version 601 engine is installed in pretty much every aircraft except for the 110C4N and the C7 late. So these power settings that I'm going to mention now are applicable for the C2, the C4, and the C7, as well as the Night Fighter version, which I haven't shown in this video yet, but it's basically just a reskin of the C4 with no other differences, so it's not really something that I need to highlight especially. So, what are the cruise settings? Well, The unlimited cruise setting for the 110C4, for example, is 1.15 ATA, which is here, right about. So this is the ATA gauge for the left engine. This is the ATA gauge for the right engine, and right about here is 1.15 ATA. And the RPM for this unlimited setting should be about 2,200 RPM. Then we have a 30-minute rating, which is shown here. So this is the unlimited. The D letter denotes it. The 30-minute rating is 1.2 ATA and 2,300 RPM. These red markings actually look like they're a little bit off, but that's just because the camera is currently centered and not taking into account the shift of the instruments. So unlimited, as said, 1.15 and 2,200, 30-minute limit 1.2 and 2,300, and the 5-minute limit is 1.3 ATA, which is this thicker white marking, and 2,400 RPM. So you see the RPM limits are actually slightly underneath those for the 109. In the 109, in the E4, for example, you can actually, in the 1-minute limit boost and war emergency power setting, you can actually go up to 2,500, but the C4 doesn't have this 1-minute limit. It only has the 5-minute limit, which you should never exceed 2,400 RPM for prolonged periods. So this is it for the 601A engined aircraft. The aircraft with the DV601P obviously have more powerful engine settings, and they can actually run higher RPMs, but actually in the Team Fusion wiki there is no concise information in terms of how high you can go. I assume, based on the 109 E4N, that you can go up to a maximum of 2,600 RPM, because that's the limit for the 109 E4N. And I guess the maximum boost for the 601P in the 110 is also 1.35 ATA. So the cruise settings for the 601N are slightly higher, so the unlimited setting should be about 1.2 ATA. The 30-minute limit is approximately 1.25, I assume, and the 5-minute limit is then 1.35. Okay, time to come to a topic that is rather complex, and that is the fuel system in the 110. Being a 2-engine aircraft and having 4 fuel tanks, yeah, that's right, 4 fuel tanks, there is actually some complicated mechanism included in the aircraft and even modeled in IL-2 Cliffs of Dover, with which you can transfer fuel in case of fuel tank damage. So let's have a look at some of the instruments in the cockpit. Here's our fuel gauge, and here is our fuel content gauge selector. So you can, with the fuel gauge, you can only have a look at the fuel content of a single fuel tank at a time. You cannot, you don't have more than one, so you can only have a look at one at a time. There are 5 settings for the fuel content gauge selector, which is off, 1, 2, 3, and 4. The first position, which is now selected, is the front left tank, which it also says here, front left. The next position is front right, rear left, rear right. And you can switch back as you like. So this is it for the fuel gauge, and what's also interesting is this box to our right here. this actually controls the fuel pump with which you can actually transfer fuel from the auxiliary tanks, so the rear tanks, to the main front tanks. And what this does is we have two switches here which act independently of each other. This switch here actually commands which main fuel tank is being fueled by the auxiliary tanks should you switch on the fuel transfer. So you can either choose the auxiliary tanks to fuel the front left tank, which you need to switch in this position. And should you want to actually increase the fuel content of the main front right fuel tank, you have to switch it over here. So this is front left, this is front right. And what this does is actually switch the fuel transfer on. So there is a on setting here, which is ein in German, and there's also an off or aus setting right here. So in this position, the fuel transfer is actually inactive. There's also a neutral setting here. When it looks like this, when it's pointing straight down, this is sort of a neutral setting, which basically is the same as off. So, what use is this? Well, basically, if you have a very long flight, your front fuel tanks will eventually run short of fuel, and in order not to have the engines die, you should at some point have a look at the fuel gauge for both front tanks and then transfer fuel from the auxiliary tanks to the main fuel tanks. What this is also handy for is in case you have a punctured tank, let's say you have been hit by AAA or shot by a fighter and your front left tank, for example, is punctured and you're losing fuel. Eventually it will be running dry, and so you have to switch both engines to run on the right front tank. And of course, running both engines on one fuel tank is going to run the fuel tank dry pretty quickly. So in case, for example, if the left front fuel tank is punctured and you have to switch the engines to the right front tank and it's running low on fuel, you would have to set it like this. So it's currently set to transfer to the right front fuel tank, and then during flight you switch it to ein, and then you should have a look at the fuel content continuously, because the pump does not shut off by itself once the front right fuel tank is full. So you have to have an eye on that, and then when it's full you can switch it off, check the fuel contents of the auxiliary fuel tanks, and if there is some more left in both of them, you can later on transfer that as well. As I've said, you can actually also command from which fuel tank each of the two engines actually are being fed, and this is done using these fuel cogs here. So currently they are in the off position because I'm just standing on the airfield and I don't have my engines running, but there are 1, 2, 3, 4 settings per fuel cog. First setting is off. Then this is actually kind of confusing, so just bear with me. For the fuel cog 1, this is the fuel cog for the left engine. First position tells the engine to feed from the right engine. Second position tells the left engine to feed from the left main tank, and the uppermost position tells it to feed from both main tanks. And for the fuel cog 2 of the right engine, it's exactly the other way around, so it gets complicated. So this is off position. First position then tells the right engine to feed from the left main fuel tank. Second position tells it to feed from the right main tank, and the uppermost position tells it to feed from both tanks. So in our scenario that we had just before, let's say the main left tank is damaged and it's running dry, and we have just set the fuel to transfer to the right main tank. But of course the left tank is going to run dry, and what do we do with the engines? So what we can do is actually both engines, we can switch them both to feed from the right main tank. So how do we do this? Did you remember? Now we have them both set to off. So the left fuel cock needs to be set to position 1, and the fuel cock for the right engine needs to be set to position 2. So the second position for each engine is the fuel cock, the fuel tank of that respective side. For the left engine, second position would be left main tank. Second position for the right engine would be right tank. So now this is feeding from the right tank, this is feeding from the right tank. And that way you can actually conserve fuel and not completely waste it. Alright, so let's discuss how to actually take off in this aircraft. So the first thing to do would be to set the fuel cocks for both engines to feed from both fuel tanks. So that's done using these fuel cocks. You can also set them on a hotkey. I have that mapped as well. So fuel cocks are on. Then you need to check your prop pitch. It is currently set to 12 o'clock, but I like to check myself on that every time. And then we can already start the engines. Make sure your throttle is not fully in the forward position. You can put in a little bit of throttle. Sometimes when you have the throttle in the idle position, your engines won't start, so what usually helps is just giving just like an inch of throttle. Okay, so what we have to do now is to wait for the engines to warm up. So we need about 60 degrees water temperature and 40 degrees oil temperature. And our radiators are fully closed. That will speed up the warming up of the engine. And what you can also do is step on the brakes fully. I've got this set on a hotkey. And then add just a bit of power. Just so much that the aircraft doesn't move, or even worse, nose over. You can see the temperature is rising steadily to about 25 oil, already over 30 for the water. Okay, so we have reached our 40 degrees of oil temperature. Water temperature is still a bit under 60, but it'll warm up in time. So, of course, do not forget to open your radiators, especially on the ground. You have to open them fully. So, let's head over to the takeoff position. We have the runway just ahead of us. So we are in a very good position to take off here. I'm just rolling into the runway just now. Okay. Okay, so what you also want to do before you take off is first of all switch on your gun sight. This is optional, not necessary. Another thing to do, especially if you plan on flying using the autopilot, which I'm going to explain to you now, is you have two compasses in your 110. You have the repeater compass, which is basically the main compass, and you have your directional gyro. And then of course you have here your course autopilot preset, with which you determine which course you actually want to fly using the autopilot. So it is advisable to set the directional gyro up to the same heading as the repeater compass. And you do that by clicking here. It says directional gyro increase and decrease. So I am going to set this to the same value as the repeater compass. 16. Okay. Looks like this is over 20, but that's just the perspective, as you can see here, because we're looking at an angle onto it. Okay, so they are matching each other now, and the course autopilot preset, as said, determines where your aircraft will eventually steer, and it is very advisable that, let's say, if you want to fly a heading of 330, that you actually align your aircraft in the general direction of the course. You don't have to be like spot on. If you deviate a few degrees, it doesn't hurt you, but I mean, you shouldn't be flying in a totally different direction, because otherwise the autopilot will maneuver the aircraft quite violently, and you actually run the risk of crashing, because the autopilot does not keep altitude. The autopilot in 110 only holds course. It doesn't hold altitude like in the German bombers, the U-88 and Heinkel 111. So you have to keep an eye on that. That is why I advise you fly in the general direction of where you want to go and then switch on the autopilot. But I'm going to show you the autopilot at work in just a few minutes. What you also want to do before taking off is actually setting up your landing flaps to 10 degrees. Unfortunately, the indicator for that is right behind the throttle handles. So you can see here there's a bar depicting the position of the landing flaps. It's a little bit of fumbling around, really. Okay, fair enough. I think it's not spot on 10, but it'll do. Okay, so we are aligned and ready to go. Radiators are open and everything is set up. So let's take off. Okay, we are airborne, and it is advisable in the 110 to not retract the gear right away, because it does mess with your center of gravity. So it's best to wait till you have a little bit of altitude and a little bit of speed, then you can retract the gear, because the aircraft is going to get a lot more nose heavy once the gear is retracted. Of course, you also have to check up on your prop pitch, reduce your power as necessary. I set it here to 1.15, so that's the unlimited cruise setting, and propeller pitch is 11:30, which for this airspeed corresponds to about 2200 RPM. Okay, so I'm going to show you the autopilot now. So, as said, I want to fly, say, a course of 330. So what I have to do now is I actually have to set the level autopilot to that course. By the way, also don't forget to retract your flaps. So I just retracted them. But you will notice your flaps being out by the fact that your aircraft is shuddering a little bit. I have to adjust my prop pitch there. So I'm heading in the general direction now, and what you have to do is actually set the course autopilot preset to that value. The course autopilot preset does not change with your direction. The best way to do this is actually to use a hotkey. I have set this to Control and A and Shift and A for left and right adjustments. So I am going to set this now to 330, adjusting my course a little bit. So these two arrows here line up, because the smaller the deviation is, the easier it is for the autopilot to actually hold course. So when you've got them lined up, you press A for the autopilot and it says Kurssteuerung mode course. And don't worry if your aircraft dives down, you can adjust that by using elevator trim, because the autopilot in 110 only holds course, it does not hold altitude, as I've already said. Of course you can use your trim in a 110. The 110 is equipped very generously. It has trim for all axes, elevator, ailerons and rudder. So do not hesitate using the trim in a 110. Okay, so the autopilot is now holding course. What you want to do is maybe trim the aircraft before entering the course autopilot, because as you maybe saw, the autopilot was side slipping a little bit right there. So I'm going to try again. I'm going to use some rudder trim. Trimming the ailerons as well. And now let's slam the autopilot in again. Okay, so as you see, the aircraft is now flying by itself, which is quite handy because you can fly hands off. If I actually have my hands now on my lap and I don't have to do anything. Okay, so this is the autopilot then. So to bring an end to this tutorial, I am going to show you now a landing in the 110, which is pretty straightforward. The 110 is a very nice flying aircraft, so there's not a lot to really take care of. We have an airfield just ahead of us, and some people completely deploy the flaps to the landing position in 110. You don't necessarily need to. 110 also lands quite well with the flaps completely retracted. For the landing, I advise you to put your prop pitch back up to 12 o'clock, because you're going to come in at about 200 km/h or less, and at that speed you really need the prop pitch at 12 o'clock to get power out of the engine. Of course, you have to press twice on the gear button to set it to down position because there's a neutral setting. Actually, if you want to be truly historical and authentic about it, you would have to set the gear to neutral after takeoff, because the neutral setting just means that the hydraulic pump does not try and pull the gear in. So if it's just set to up, the gear hydraulics would be working the entire time. Okay, so we are coming in quite well, I think. Speed isn't too high, we are slightly below 200. Glide angle looks good. Need to flare out. Yeah, that was a good landing. You might then, on the ground, it's good if you just pull back on the stick, just keep the tail on the ground, especially if you use the wheel brakes, which are very effective in the German aircraft. You really, if you use a hotkey for the brakes, you just want to tap that every other second, because if you the hotkey is just basically a on-off switch for the brakes, so you can either use them fully, the brakes, or you don't use them at all. And if you keep your finger on the brake button for more than like a split second, you're going to nose over very quickly. Okay, I'm going to stop the aircraft right here. So, I hope this tutorial was helpful for you. I think I've covered most or all topics of interest about the 110. We've covered engine power settings, we've covered the fuel transfer system and the fuel cogs, how they work. We've covered the autopilot, we've had a complete takeoff and landing approach. So if there is anything left that you want to know, feel free to post in the comments, and I am going to try and answer your questions to the best of my knowledge. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'm going to see you in the next one.